What is the true value of a person? Is it found in the title etched onto a frosted glass door, the crisp cut of a tailored suit, or the weight of the watch on their wrist? Or is it something quieter? Something hidden in the shadows, polished to a brilliant shine by hardship, a treasure buried so deep that no one ever thinks to look for it. We are taught to measure worth in dollars and promotions, in followers and headlines. But what if the most valuable asset in a billion-dollar empire isn't in the boardroom, but pushing a mop down its empty hallways after everyone else has gone home? This is the story of a woman who was invisible, and the man who finally learned how to see. Her name was Elara, and she moved through the monolithic Thorn Industries tower like a ghost. By day, the building hummed with power, a vertical kingdom of ambition and steel. By night, it was her domain, a silent, hollow giant. Her world was one of flickering fluorescent lights in utility closets, the squeak of her cart's wheels on polished marble, and the sharp, clean scent of ammonia. She wore a faded blue uniform that rendered her anonymous, a functional part of the building's machinery, no different from the air conditioning or the elevators. But within this invisible woman was a universe of unspoken words. Elara was a keeper of languages, a secret polyglot. While the executives on the 80th floor struggled to close deals in broken German or clumsy Mandarin, Elara could dream in 5 languages and hold a conversation in a dozen more. It was a gift born of necessity and solitude. Years spent in the hushed quiet of libraries, escaping the suffocating silence of the small apartment where her mother's illness had stolen the music from their lives. She had taught herself, one borrowed book at a time, finding solace in the elegant script of Japanese kanji and the romantic lilt of Italian. The words were her friends, her escape, and her secret shield against a world that saw only a cleaner. Her life was a repeating cycle of work and worry. The cleaning shift ended just before dawn, and then it was a long bus ride home to relieve the overnight nurse, to sit by her mother's bedside, hold her frail hand, and read to her from worn paperbacks. The medical bills were a mountain, a suffocating weight that grew larger with every passing week. She was strong, but she was tired. So deeply, bone-achingly tired. One night, her routine brought her to the pinnacle of the tower, the office of the king himself, Julian Thorne. The CEO. The papers called him the Ice King, a ruthless prodigy who had inherited his father's empire and tripled its value before he was 30. His office was less a workspace and more a testament to power. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, offering a god's-eye view of the glittering city below. The desk was a slab of dark, forbidding wood, and on it, under the sharp beam of a single lamp, lay a stack of discarded papers. Julian Thorne was still there, a silhouette against the city lights. He stood with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him, the very picture of isolated authority. He was a man who commanded legions but seemed utterly alone. He was staring down at the sprawling metropolis his family had helped build, but his mind was on a single, catastrophic failure. A deal with the reclusive Japanese tech magnate, Mr. Tanaka. A deal that had collapsed that very afternoon in a spectacular flame-out of mistranslation and cultural missteps. It was a failure that would cost the company hundreds of millions and, worse, would be a stain on the pristine legacy his father had left him. The burden of that legacy was a physical weight on his shoulders, heavier than any portfolio. Elara entered the office so quietly he didn't stir. She began her work, emptying the wastebasket, dusting the shelves, her movements economical and silent. She was trained to be unnoticed. As she approached the desk to wipe it down, her eyes fell upon the papers. They were transcripts of the meeting. One column in English, the other in Japanese. Her gaze scanned the Japanese text, and her mind, a finely tuned instrument of language, immediately snagged on an error. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a deep, fundamental misunderstanding of a key concept, a word that had a dozen meanings depending on context and honorifics. The translator had chosen the most sterile, corporate definition, missing the poetic, philosophical nuance Mr. Tanaka had intended. They had translated a flower as a financial instrument. They had heard a business proposal when the man was speaking of legacy, of a garden planted for grandchildren he would never meet. A wave of something, audacity, empathy, foolishness, washed over her. She thought of her mother, of the bills, of the crushing, relentless invisibility of her own life. For one brief moment, she wanted to be heard. Her hand trembled as she picked up a stray pen from the desk. On a small, clean notepad, she hesitated, then wrote. Not in English, but in perfect, formal Kigo, the most respectful form of Japanese. She didn't correct them outright. Instead, she posed a question. Forgive the intrusion, she wrote, her characters flowing with an artist's precision. Regarding Mr. Tanaka's use of the term gyujin, is it possible he was not speaking of market potential, but of the profound, quiet grace of an idea not yet fully realized? A beauty that is felt rather than seen, she placed the small note gently on top of the transcript, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a reckless, insane act. She could be fired. She should have just wiped the desk and moved on. She quickly finished her duties and fled the silent, cavernous office, the ghost retreating back into the shadows, convinced her message would be swept away with the morning's trash. But it wasn't. Hours later, when the first hint of dawn was breaking the horizon, Julian Thorne finally turned from the window. Exhausted and defeated, he slumped into his chair, ready to admit failure. His eyes fell on the transcript, and then on the small, square note perched atop it. He frowned, picking it up. He didn't speak Japanese fluently, but he knew enough to recognize the script. He ran the characters through a high-end translation software. The result was clunky, but the meaning was clear enough to send a jolt through his entire body. The profound, quiet grace, it was like a key turning in a lock he didn't even know was there. He remembered the look on Tanaka's face, the subtle disappointment, the way the old man had looked out the window at the bonsai tree in the corner. The translators had talked about synergy and Q4 projections. Tanaka had been talking about the soul of the work. Julian stared at the note, at the elegant, confident script. This wasn't the work of a corporate translator. This was the insight of a poet, a philosopher. Who had been in his office? He buzzed his head of security, his voice sharp with an urgency that startled the man on the other end of the line. Find out who cleaned my office tonight. I don't care what it takes. I want them in front of me. Now, the summons came mid-morning. Elara was sitting by her mother's bed, reading aloud from a book of Pablo Neruda's poetry, when her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. It was her supervisor, his voice tight with panic. Elara, you need to come to the tower. Right now. The CEO wants to see you, the words didn't compute. The CEO? Mr. Thorne. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. The note. It had to be the note. She was going to be fired. How could she have been so stupid, so arrogant? She apologized to the nurse, threw on the cleanest clothes she owned, a worn pair of jeans and a faded gray sweater, and took the bus back to the city, her stomach churning with a dread so profound it felt like grief. The journey up to the 80th floor was a trip to another world. The elevator was a silent, mirrored box, whisking her away from the familiar world of service corridors and into the heart of power. When the doors opened, a severe-looking executive assistant led her through a hushed expanse of white marble and minimalist art. She felt like a stray animal that had wandered into a museum. The office was even more intimidating by day. The city sprawled below, a map of a world she had no part in. Julian Thorne was not alone. He sat behind his immense desk, his expression unreadable. To his right stood another man, impeccably dressed, with a smug, dismissive sneer that seemed permanently affixed to his face. This was Marcus Vance, the Vice President of International Relations, the man who had personally led the failed Tanaka negotiation. He looked Elara up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn sneakers, and a small, cruel smile touched his lips. Elara stood before the desk, her hands clenched together, her head bowed. She braced herself for the inevitable. "You're the one who cleaned my office last night," Julian Thorne said. It wasn't a question. His voice was calm, low, but it carried an unnerving intensity. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you write this?" He held up the small piece of paper. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. She just nodded, a tiny, miserable movement. I am so sorry, sir. It was inappropriate. I overstepped. It will never happen again. Please, I need this job." Marcus Vance let out a short, derisive laugh. "Julian, this is absurd. We're wasting time. She's a cleaner. Security should be escorting her out, not you interrogating her about her." Doodles. Julian ignored him completely, his eyes fixed on Alara. "Explain it to me," he said, his voice softer now. "The note." Eugen. Alara looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She saw, for the first time, that his eyes weren't cold. They were sharp, intelligent, and searching. She took a shaky breath. It's a concept from Japanese aesthetics," she began, her voice gaining a little strength. "It doesn't have a direct English translation. It means, a profound, mysterious grace. An awareness of the universe that triggers an emotional response too deep for words. When Mr. Tanaka used it, I don't believe he was referring to the market's unpredictability. I think he was speaking about the spirit of his technology. About its potential to create something beautiful and meaningful that can't be measured on a balance sheet." "You offered him numbers." He was asking for a poem. As she spoke, the fear began to recede, replaced by the quiet confidence she felt when immersed in her world of words. She explained the cultural context, the importance of indirect communication, the respect for subtlety that permeated Japanese high-level business. She wasn't just translating a word, she was illuminating a worldview. Marcus Vance stared at her, his smugness curdling into disbelief and then into raw fury. This janitor was lecturing him, the head of international relations, on cultural nuance. She was making him look like a fool in front of the CEO. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. She read a Wikipedia article. "Julian. Are we really going to stake the company's future on the linguistic theories of the cleaning staff?" Julian Thorne didn't even glance at him. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on Alara. A long, heavy silence filled the room. The city hummed 1,000 feet below. Alara's heart pounded, a frantic drum against the quiet. Then, Julian made a decision. It wasn't a decision born of logic or precedent or the advice of his highly paid consultants. It was a leap of faith, a bet on an anomaly, a gut instinct he hadn't trusted in years. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice like chips of ice. "Book a flight to Kyoto." For 3 inches he then turned his full attention back to Alara, whose eyes were wide with confusion. "I am going to make you an offer, and I need you to listen very carefully. The Tanaka deal isn't dead. I'm going back, and you're coming with me. Not as a cleaner. As my personal advisor and translator. I want you to lead the conversation." Alara's mind went blank. The words were nonsensical, a language she didn't understand. Her. In Kyoto. Advising a billionaire. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and too much worry. Marcus was apoplectic. "Julian, have you lost your mind? The board will crucify you. She has no experience, no qualifications, no background. She scrubs floors for a living." Julian finally turned to face his VP, his expression hardening. "Her background is that she understood in 5 minutes what your entire team of overpaid experts missed in 5 months. Her qualification is that she sees what we are blind to. That is more valuable to me right now than 100 Ivy League degrees." He turned back to Alara, his voice softening once more. "I know this is sudden. But I am prepared to make it worth your while. I will pay you a consulting fee of $500,000. And if we succeed, if Mr. Tanaka signs the deal, you will receive a bonus of $5 million. Enough to solve your problems." I imagine. The numbers were so vast, so astronomical, they had no meaning. $5 million. It was a figure from a movie, a fairy tale. It was a number that meant her mother would have the best doctors, the best care, for the rest of her life. It meant an end to the crushing weight, the sleepless nights, the constant, gnawing fear. It meant freedom. But the fear of failure, of humiliation, was just as powerful. I can't, she stammered. I'm not. I don't know anything about business. I'm not one of you, I don't need you to be one of us, Julian said, his voice firm but not unkind. I have enough of us. I need you to be you. I need your eyes. Your ears. Your mind. Will you do it? Ilara looked from Julian's intense, expectant face to Marcus's livid, contemptuous one. She thought of her mother's pale, tired smile. She thought of the mountain of bills on her kitchen table. And she made a choice. The underdog, the ghost, the invisible woman, found her voice. Yes, she said, the word small but solid, a single stone that would start an avalanche. Yes, Mr. Thorne. I will. The aftermath of her decision was a whirlwind of disbelief and quiet panic. As soon as Ilara left the office, her mind reeling, the storm broke between Julian and his inner circle. Marcus Vance, his face flushed with rage, immediately demanded a private meeting. This is career suicide, Julian. Not just for you, but for the company. The moment the board hears you've replaced our entire advisory team with a janitor, they will call for your head. Our stock will plummet. This is an act of sheer insanity. He paced the office, his gestures wild, his voice rising with every word. He saw his own position, his own prestige, being threatened by this nobody, and it was intolerable. His attack was personal, aimed at Julian's deepest insecurity. Is this what Thorne Industries has become? A vanity project? Your father built this empire on logic, on strength, on impenetrable strategy. He would be ashamed to see you gambling it all away on a whim, on some Cinderella fantasy. The mention of his father struck a nerve, as Marcus knew it would. A muscle twitched in Julian's jaw. But his voice remained dangerously calm. My father also taught me that the most valuable resource is often the one everyone else overlooks. You saw a cleaner, Marcus. I see an untapped asset. Your team failed. Your strategy was flawed. We have nothing to lose and everything to gain by trying a different approach. You will accompany us to Kyoto. You will observe. And you will not interfere. Is that understood? The barely veiled threat hung in the air. Marcus, realizing he had pushed as far as he could, gave a stiff, resentful nod and left the office, already plotting how to contain the damage, or, if necessary, how to ensure Ilara's failure was so spectacular that Julian would have no choice but to fire her and come crawling back to him. Then came the voice of reason. David Chen, Julian's chief counsel and the closest thing he had to a friend, entered the office with a weary sigh. David was a pragmatist, a man who dealt in risks and liabilities. He had been with the Thorne family for decades, having started as a junior associate under Julian's father. He cared for Julian, not just as a client, but as the son of his mentor. Julian, he said softly, closing the door behind him. We need to talk. Not as CEO and lawyer, but as two people who have the company's best interests at heart. Marcus is an arrogant fool, but he's not entirely wrong. The risk you are taking is astronomical. The legal and financial exposure if this goes public in the wrong way, it's staggering. Julian moved to the window, looking down at the city again. What's the alternative, David? We crawl back to Tanaka with the same failed team and the same failed pitch. We admit defeat and let our biggest competitor swoop in. Failure is already here. This is the only move they won't see coming. David walked over to stand beside him. It's not the move I'm worried about. It's the player. This woman, Ilara. I ran a preliminary background check. She's got no formal education past high school. She's been a cleaner her whole adult life to support a sick mother. She's drowning in medical debt. A person that desperate, can you trust her motives? $5 million is a powerful incentive to tell you whatever you want to hear, that's why I trust her, Julian countered, turning to face him. She isn't motivated by greed or ambition. She's motivated by love. By loyalty. Did you see her eyes when she spoke about the language? There was passion in them, David. A brilliance that has been hidden away for years. I'm not betting on a cleaner. I'm betting on that brilliance. David studied his friend's face. He saw a spark there he hadn't seen in years, a flicker of the daring, intuitive young man Julian had been before the weight of his father's legacy had settled on him, forcing him into a rigid mold of conservative, ruthless efficiency. All right, David said with a sigh of resignation, but also a hint of admiration. I'll draw up the contract. We'll frame it as a special consultant role, buried in a subsidiary's budget. We can mitigate some of the fallout if things go south. But Julian, be careful. You're not just risking the company. You're risking yourself. Meanwhile, Elara was in a state of shock. She was given a temporary corporate apartment, a sterile, beautiful space that felt as foreign as a moon base. A personal shopper arrived with racks of clothing, tailored suits, elegant dresses, silk blouses. The transformation was dizzying. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back, a woman dressed for a life that wasn't hers. But the external changes were superficial. The real transformation was happening on the inside. Julian had given her one thing more valuable than money or clothes: access. She had a key card to the executive library, a quiet, wood-paneled sanctuary of knowledge. For the next 3 days, she didn't sleep. She consumed everything she could about Tanaka, his company, his personal philosophies, his love for Zen gardening and 17th-century poetry. She cross-referenced articles, translated interviews, and built a psychological and cultural profile of the man that was more detailed than anything the company's high-priced research firm could have produced. She wasn't just preparing for a meeting, she was preparing to understand a man's soul. Julian found her there on the second night, surrounded by stacks of books, a laptop open, her brow furrowed in concentration. She hadn't heard him enter. He stood for a moment, just watching her. In the soft light of the library lamp, without the cleaner's uniform or the weight of exhaustion on her shoulders, he saw her clearly. He saw the fierce intelligence, the unyielding determination. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a mix of admiration and a strange, protective instinct. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. She jumped, startled. "Mr. Thorne. I'm sorry, I lost track of time." "Call me Julian," he said. "And I should be thanking you. David told me you requested the raw data files from the last 10 years of Tanaka's public speeches. No one's ever asked for that before." "His language has changed over the last decade," she explained, her voice alive with discovery. "It's become more philosophical, less focused on growth and more on permanence. Everyone is pitching him the future, but I think he's thinking about the past. About what endures." They talked for over an hour. He asked about her life, and for the first time, she told someone in this new, terrifying world about her mother, about the libraries, about the quiet life she had built around words. And he, in turn, opened up in a way he never did with his board members or executives. He spoke of his father, not as a business legend, but as a demanding, distant figure whose approval he was still trying to earn, even years after the man's death. In the hushed quiet of the library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, two lonely people from vastly different worlds found a small patch of common ground. The invisible woman was becoming visible. And the Ice King was beginning to melt. The flight to Kyoto was a study in contrasts. The private jet was a capsule of impossible luxury, a world of soft leather seats, polished wood, and silent, attentive flight attendants. For Elara, who had only ever traveled by city bus, it was an experience of profound dislocation. She sat by the window, watching the clouds stream past, feeling as though she were suspended not just in the air, but between two entirely different lives. The tension inside the cabin was thick enough to taste. Julian was focused, reviewing documents on a tablet, his face a mask of concentration. Marcus Vance sat across the aisle, radiating a palpable aura of resentment. He made a show of ignoring Elara, speaking only to Julian in loud, jargon-filled sentences, a clear attempt to mark his territory and emphasize Elara's exclusion from their world. He saw her as an imposter, a temporary amusement, and he was determined to make her feel it. "Julian, once we're on the ground, I've arranged a pre-meeting with Tanaka's CFO," Marcus announced, his voice booming slightly in the quiet cabin. "We need to hammer out the EBITDA projections before we get bogged down in the cultural niceties. We can't let this new approach derail the fundamentals." He didn't look at Elara, but the barb was aimed directly at her. Julian looked up from his tablet, his eyes cold. "There will be no pre-meeting, Marcus. We will follow the plan. Elara will lead the conversation. You will provide financial data only when asked." Marcus's face tightened. Humiliated, he changed tactics, turning his attention directly to Elara for the first time. "Well, in that case," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "perhaps our new special advisor can enlighten us on Tanaka's latest SEC filings. What are your thoughts on their Q3 debt-to-equity ratio, Ms.?" He let her name hang in the air, a deliberate act of forgetting. Elara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. She knew nothing about debt-to-equity ratios. She was an expert in language, not finance. It was a transparent trap, designed to expose her ignorance and make her look foolish in front of Julian. She could see the smirk playing on Marcus's lips. She took a breath, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm afraid I can't speak to the specifics of their financial filings, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "That's your area of expertise. Mine is in understanding the man who signs the checks, not just the checks themselves. For example, I know that he quotes the poet Matsuo Basho in his annual reports, and that his favorite proverb is, 'Fall down 7 times, get up 8. My analysis suggests he values resilience and beauty far more than short-term profit margins. Perhaps we should focus on the fundamentals of the man, not just the company." The response was so perfectly executed, so calmly delivered, that it left Marcus speechless. She hadn't taken the bait. Instead, she had validated his role while simultaneously reinforcing the unique value of her own, subtly reminding everyone why she was there. Julian looked at her, and a flicker of a smile, a rare and genuine thing, touched his lips. He gave a slight nod of approval before returning to his work, leaving Marcus stewing in a silence of his own making. The rest of the flight passed with a fragile truce. Later, as the coast of Japan appeared on the horizon, a breathtaking landscape of green mountains and blue sea, Julian moved to the seat next to Elara. "He won't try that again," he said quietly. "Thank you," she whispered, still staring out the window. "I was terrified, you didn't show it," he replied. "You have a strength you don't even realize." They sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the world unfold below. "Are you scared?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. He paused, considering the question. The Ice King, the titan of industry, was not supposed to feel fear. But this was different. "Yes," he admitted, the confession startling them both with its honesty. "I've bet everything on this. Not just the company's money. I've bet on my own judgment. Something I haven't done in a very long time. I've spent my whole life executing my father's vision. This is the first time I'm truly following my own." He looked at her, his gaze direct and sincere. "I'm betting on you, Elara." The weight of his words, the trust they implied, was heavier than any sum of money. It was a responsibility that both terrified and exhilarated her. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting for her mother's survival. She was fighting for him, for this man who had looked past her uniform and seen her. As the plane began its descent into Kyoto, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not let him down. The meeting was not in a sterile corporate boardroom. It was at a traditional tea house nestled in a secluded bamboo garden, a world away from the noise of the city. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cedar. The only sounds were the gentle clacking of a bamboo water fountain and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The room was minimalist, with tatami mat floors and paper screens. Mr. Tanaka sat on a cushion, a small, ancient man with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 years. He wore a simple kimono, and his presence filled the room with a quiet, unshakable authority. His team was equally silent and observant. Marcus Vance, uncomfortable in the shoeless, floor-seated environment, immediately launched into his prepared pitch. He unrolled charts, spoke of market penetration, global logistics, and shareholder value. His voice was too loud, his gestures too broad for the serene space. Mr. Tanaka listened politely, his expression placid, but Alara could see the subtle signs of his disengagement. A slight narrowing of his eyes. The way his hands remained perfectly still in his lap. He was retreating, closing a door she knew they might never get a chance to open again. Julian, sensing the disaster, shot a desperate look at Alara. It was her moment. She took a deep, centering breath and waited for Marcus to pause for air. When he did, she leaned forward slightly, her posture one of deep respect. She did not speak of business. She began by thanking Mr. Tanaka for choosing such a beautiful and peaceful location for their meeting. Then, in flawless Japanese, she commented on the single flower arrangement in the corner of the room. "The ikebana," she said softly. "The asymmetry is perfect. It speaks of the beauty of imperfection and the transient nature of all things. It reminds one of the phrase, mono no aware, the gentle sadness of passing things." Mr. Tanaka's eyes flickered toward her, a spark of interest kindling in their depths. He had not expected this. He replied, his voice raspy with age, "You have a keen eye. Few Westerners understand such concepts. They are too busy trying to conquer nature to appreciate its lessons." This was the opening. Marcus tried to jump back in, to steer the conversation back to financials, but Alara held the space with her quiet confidence. She began to speak not as a translator, but as a storyteller. She wove Julian's business proposal into a larger narrative, using the very concepts Tanaka himself valued. She spoke of Thorn Industries not as a corporation, but as a legacy, a multi-generational effort, much like the ancient gardens of Kyoto. She described the proposed technological partnership not in terms of synergy, but as two different rivers flowing together to create a greater whole. She picked up on a subtle reference he made to the changing seasons, a metaphor for the shifting market that everyone else had missed. "Mr. Tanaka," she said, "you speak of the coming winter. But we believe that by joining our strengths, we can build a greenhouse strong enough to cultivate new life, even in the coldest of seasons. A legacy that will blossom for our grandchildren." The atmosphere in the room had transformed. It was no longer a negotiation, it was a philosophical dialogue. Mr. Tanaka was leaning forward now, his full attention on Alara. He asked her questions, not about profit margins, but about her personal story, about how she came to understand his culture so deeply. He was testing her, looking for authenticity. Marcus was fuming, rendered completely irrelevant. Julian watched in utter awe. He was seeing the full, unrestrained power of her gift. She wasn't just translating words, she was building a bridge between two worlds, a bridge of empathy, respect, and profound understanding. By the end of the meeting, no contracts were signed, but something more important had happened. A connection had been forged. As they were leaving, Mr. Tanaka stopped Alara. He bowed to her, a gesture of immense respect. "You have an old soul, young woman," he said. "You speak with the heart of a poet." She was no longer a ghost. In this quiet garden, halfway around the world, the invisible woman had finally been seen. The first day had been a resounding success, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat entirely by Alara's remarkable talent. Julian was ecstatic, a weight visibly lifted from his shoulders. He insisted on a celebratory dinner for the three of them at one of Kyoto's finest restaurants. The mood should have been triumphant, but Marcus Vance's silence was a toxic cloud that hung over them. He had been sidelined, his authority usurped by a woman he considered his subordinate in every way. His humiliation was a corrosive acid eating away at his pride. While Alara and Julian discussed the day's events, their conversation easy and filled with a newfound camaraderie, Marcus was on his phone under the table, his fingers flying across the screen. He was a man cornered, and like a desperate animal, he was ready to chew off his own leg to escape the trap. He was enacting his revenge. He had a contact, a sleazy tabloid journalist who owed him a favor, a man who specialized in character assassination. Marcus crafted the narrative carefully, leaking select details: an anonymous, beautiful woman, a reclusive billionaire CEO, a sudden, inexplicable trip to Japan, a multi-million-dollar deal hanging in the balance. He painted Alara as a cunning opportunist, Cinderella from the janitor's closet, who had seduced the lonely, vulnerable Ice King. He framed Julian's brilliant, intuitive decision as a foolish, romantic whim, a lapse in judgment that put the entire Thorn Empire at risk. He hit send just as the appetizers arrived. The news broke with the silent, devastating speed of the digital age. Halfway through their meal, Julian's phone began to vibrate incessantly on the table. Then David Chen's name flashed on the screen. Julian excused himself, a frown creasing his forehead. When he returned moments later, his face was pale, his expression grim. "The deal is all over the news," he said, his voice strained. He showed his phone to Alara. The headline was sensational and cruel: "Thorn in Love. Billionaire CEO bets empire on mystery cleaner." The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and anonymous, fabricated quotes, portraying her as a manipulative gold digger and him as a lovesick fool. Her heart sank, the joy of the day turning to ash in her mouth. She felt the blood drain from her face. This was her worst fear realized. The world would not see her gift, only her position. They would never believe a man like Julian Thorn could value her mind. "The board is in an uproar," Julian continued, his voice tight. "They're calling for an emergency meeting. They think I've lost my mind." He looked across the table at Marcus, who was feigning shock and concern with an actor's skill. "This is a disaster, Julian. How could this have gotten out? Someone on Tanaka's team must have leaked it. We need to issue a denial immediately, distance the company from her completely." But Julian's eyes were narrowed, his gaze fixed on his VP. He had seen Marcus on his phone. He had noticed his sour, resentful mood all evening. He was starting to connect the dots. The leak was too precise, too perfectly timed, too damaging. It wasn't an external attack. The call was coming from inside the house. He ignored Marcus's feigned panic. He looked at Alara, whose face was a mask of devastation and shame. The moment was a crucible. Every corporate instinct, every lesson his father had ever taught him, screamed at him to cut his losses. Fire her. Issue a statement. Protect the company at all costs. But then he looked at her eyes, swimming with unshed tears, and saw not a manipulator, but a brilliant woman being cruelly, unfairly attacked. He saw the person he had talked to in the library, the woman who had faced down Marcus's mockery on the plane, the quiet genius who had charmed a Japanese industrialist with a line of poetry. He had to know. He had to hear it from her. He leaned forward, his voice low and intense, for her ears only. "Alara. Look at me. Is this what they say it is? Is any of it true?" It was the ultimate question. He wasn't asking as a CEO assessing a liability. He was asking as a man who had placed his trust in someone and needed to know if that trust was misplaced. She was shattered, but his question, the raw vulnerability in it, cut through her shock. He deserved the truth. Her integrity was the one thing they couldn't take from her. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering despite the tears threatening to fall. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "My mother is sick. I needed the money to save her. That's the only truth. The opportunity you gave me. I saw it as a chance to prove I was more than a uniform. I would never." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. He saw the raw, painful honesty in her face. He believed her. In that moment, his choice was made. It was no longer about the deal. It was about honor. "David is on his way," he said, his voice now filled with a cold, hard resolve. "He's bringing a forensic tech. We're going to find out who leaked this." He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes like steel. "And when we do, they will learn what it truly means to threaten my company." The final meeting was scheduled for the next morning. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the suffocating pressure of the scandal, which was now headline news around the world. Everyone, from the board members frantically calling Julian to the hushed bellhops at their hotel, expected him to appear alone. They expected him to cut Alara loose, to sacrifice her to save the deal and his own reputation. It was the logical, strategic move. It was what his father would have done. But when Julian Thorne walked into the serene tea house, Alara was by his side. She was pale and hadn't slept, but she held her head high. Her presence was a silent, defiant declaration. It was an act of loyalty, an act of faith, and in the cold, calculating world of corporate power, it was an act of rebellion. Marcus Vance, who was already there, stared at them, his face a mixture of disbelief and panic. This was not part of his plan. Julian was supposed to fold, to prove Marcus right. Instead, he was doubling down on his mistake. Mr. Tanaka and his team were already seated. The old man's face was impassive, but his eyes were sharp. He had, of course, been made aware of the scandal. In his world, honor and reputation were paramount. A business deal was not just a transaction, it was a marriage of houses, and a scandal on the eve of the wedding was a terrible omen. He gestured for them to sit. After the ceremonial serving of tea, he addressed Julian directly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of judgment. "Thorne-san," he said, foregoing the usual pleasantries. "I have been made aware of a certain turbulence surrounding your visit. In Japan, a man's name is his most valuable asset. The character of his associates reflects upon his own." The implication was clear. "Explain yourself. Defend your honor." Julian was about to deliver the carefully worded statement David Chen had prepared overnight, a statement that was both legally sound and strategically vague. But before he could speak, Alara did something extraordinary. She gently placed a hand on his arm, a silent request for him to wait. Then, she turned and addressed Mr. Tanaka directly. She did not make excuses or offer denials. She spoke from the heart, in the humble, poetic Japanese he understood so well. "Tanaka-sama," she began, her voice soft but clear, ringing with sincerity in the quiet room. "The stories that have been printed are full of noise and ugliness. They are designed to create shadows where there is only light. I will not speak of them. Instead, I will speak of what is true." She looked at Julian, then back at the old man. "The truth is, I was invisible. My world was small and full of worry. I was a person of no consequence. But Thorne-san, he saw something in me that no one else did. Not a woman, not a cleaner, but a key. He saw a gift I had hidden from the world, and he was not afraid of it. He did not try to own it, he sought to empower it. The world calls this weakness. They call it foolishness. But you and I, we know the truth. To see the value that is hidden from all other eyes, that is not weakness. That is the rarest and most profound form of strength." Her words hung in the air, simple, honest, and powerful. She had not defended her reputation. She had defined Julian's character. She had reframed his foolish decision as an act of visionary leadership. There was a long, profound silence. Mr. Tanaka stared at her, his ancient eyes seeing past the headlines, past the scandal, and into the soul of her words. He looked at Julian, who sat in stunned silence, moved by her defense of him. Then, he looked at Marcus, whose face was a mask of guilt. A slow, faint smile touched the old man's lips. "In my long life," Mr. Tanaka said, his voice raspy with emotion, "I have met many men of great wealth. I have met very few men of great vision. A man who trusts his own eyes over the clamor of the crowd is a man I can do business with. He turned to his aide. Prepare the contracts. We will sign. Then he looked back at Julian. But I have one condition. The deal will be contingent on Ms. Alara overseeing the cross-cultural integration team. Her vision will be essential to our shared success. It was a total victory. As the meeting concluded, Julian's phone buzzed. It was a text from David Chen. A junior employee on Marcus's team, racked with guilt and tired of his boss's bullying, had come forward with proof, copies of the texts Marcus had sent to the journalist. The evidence was irrefutable. The snake had been exposed. Julian approached Marcus, who was trying to slip away unnoticed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're fired, Marcus, he said, his voice flat and cold. My security will meet you at the hotel. Have your things packed within the hour. He turned his back on the disgraced executive and walked over to Alara, who stood by the paper screen, looking out at the bamboo garden, a single tear of relief tracing a path down her cheek. He stood beside her, not speaking, simply sharing the moment, the quiet grace of a victory that was about so much more than money. 6 months later, the Thorn Industries tower felt like a different building. Or perhaps it was simply that Alara was seeing it through different eyes. She was no longer a ghost in its hallways. She was the head of the new Global Communications and Strategy Department, a division Julian had created specifically for her. Her office was on the 78th floor, just 2 floors below his, with a view that rivaled the king's. Her mother was living in a state-of-the-art care facility, her condition stabilized, her days filled with comfort and peace. The mountain of debt was gone, replaced by a future of security and possibility. Alara walked through the lobby, no longer in a faded blue uniform but in a chic, elegant pantsuit. People nodded to her, said her name with respect. She was visible. She was seen. But she never forgot the feeling of being invisible, and it made her a different kind of leader. She knew the names of the cleaning staff, the security guards, the baristas in the coffee shop. She saw the people everyone else overlooked. One evening, she was standing by the large window in her new office, looking down at the city lights, a mirror image of Julian on that first fateful night. She heard the door open and turned to see him standing there. He had stopped wearing the armor of his Ice King persona. His smiles were more frequent, his eyes softer. The success of the Tanaka deal had not just saved the company, it had liberated him. He had proven to the board, to the world, but most importantly, to himself, that his own vision was worthy. Good work today, he said, his voice warm. The integration is ahead of schedule. Tanaka adores you. He said you have the soul of a poet and the mind of a general. She smiled. He just appreciates someone who understands that a balance sheet can't measure everything. They stood in a comfortable silence, the city glittering below them. The professional barrier that had once existed between them had long since eroded, replaced by a deep well of mutual respect and a current of unspoken affection. Thank you, Alara, he said, his voice suddenly serious. And I don't mean for the deal. I mean for everything. You reminded me of who I was supposed to be. Before the legacy, before the pressure. You helped me learn how to see again. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. The company's future is secure, he continued, his gaze holding hers. But lately, I find myself more interested in ours. The question hung in the air, a beautiful, unwritten poem. It was an offer of a different kind, one not measured in dollars, but in possibility. And Alara, the woman who had been found in the shadows, stepped into the light, ready to write the next chapter. So I ask you again, what is the true value of a person? Is it found in the silence they keep, the burdens they carry, or the unseen gifts they hold within? Look around you. Who are the invisible people in your life? The barista who remembers your order, the security guard who wishes you a good night, the quiet colleague in the corner cubicle. What incredible worlds might you discover if you only stop and truly see them? Share this story if you believe in hidden potential, and tell us in the comments, who did you fail to see today?